So we have this educational video from this I don't know person from the USA called Candance Owens. I believe it's Trump supporter and some kind of political activist. Anyways, just I'm gonna react to her video. Okay.
And now for a brief history of slavery. Here's the first thing you need to know. Slavery was not invented by white people. It did not start in 1619 when the first slaves came to Jamestown. It existed before then. It did not start in 1492 when Columbus discovered the New World. In fact, when the intrepid explorer landed in the Bahamas, the native Taino tribe hoped that he would help them defeat their aggressive neighbors, the Caribs. The Caribs enslaved the Taino and, on occasion, served them for dinner.
Yeah. So obviously, she's talking about slavery in general, and I'm a bit surprised by the fact that she needs to explain this. This is something that if you studied in Africa or in Europe, you have studied this before. I mean, during the feudal times, there was a slavery. Okay, slavery was a practice that many countries did. It's not just related to Africans or Europeans. Slavery was just social status. If you think about that way, in certain countries, when you have a war and you lose the war, you become a slave. I mean, there will be a film soon, Gladiator, which basically shows that in ancient Rome and many other civilizations, there were slaves. Now, obviously, she's going back in time in order to explain what a slave is. I don't really understand why. And I guess when African Americans talks about slavery, they're talking about the transatlantic slavery, which is related to them. Who cares about, or why would they care about what happened to these Mohican Indians or to the Slavs in Eastern Europe, for example, okay? Or to like Westerners in Northern Africa, because they were also slaves at what point, and they were sold in Northern Africa, okay, by slavers that were black Africans and Arabs, okay? So, my question here is why is she playing this way with like it's like cartoonist way to explain this for children, okay? I think what African American are talking about is what happened to them, and we're talking about transatlantic slavery. There is a difference between the slavery that existed during feudal times, okay, and before that, which was pretty much serfdom, okay? You were born a slave and you were a slave. Now, the slavery that existed in Africa, it wasn't the same as the one we've seen historically in Europe. The slavery that existed in many countries or empires or whatever you not call it in Africa, many became slaves after losing a war, but you could gain your freedom after that. Okay, you remain a human being, although you are treated as a slave or you are considered a slave. Back then, what he's trying to describe here, you were considered a human being. However, as far as my knowledge goes, in the USA was a completely different story. Individuals were classified and considered animals. There is a moral approach here that is completely missing. These people are not considered human beings anymore. They are considered animals. Therefore, the treatment they received in the USA was completely justified. And I'm talking about rape. I'm talking about like disgusting treatment of these individuals. They're used like cattle, basically. There's a story of a really strong slave. He had really strong genes that he was used to impregnate other slaves, and he had over 200 children with different females. So he was used basically as a bull, okay, to fertilize females and have kids. And those kids, they were slaves and they worked in plantations because they were considered animals and not human beings. And I think that's the main difference here. Africans that sold slaves back in the continent to these Europeans, they were sold as human beings, and then the Europeans transformed them into animals. and then they send them to the Americas to cultivate, tobacco and other crops. Now, when the Africans started realizing the wrongdoing of selling the enemies of war because it was depopulating their countries, their empires, they confronted the Europeans. They also understood that the Europeans were treating these individuals as animals, and they confronted them. And what these European enslavers from different religions, some of them were Jews, some of them were Christians, okay, and they were also Muslims. When they confronted these individuals, okay, what they did, they brought the entire power of their governments, okay, from their countries against the African countries. We have the Portuguese, we have the Spaniards, we have the British that came to fight against these Africans, that rebel against them taking Africans as slaves. So that needs to be considered. The Africans were not happy when they realized how they changed the status of these individuals from slaves to animals. And that's something that she has to mention. She needs to provide context. Let's see.
Slavery existed in Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. The word slave actually comes from the Slavs of Eastern Europe. Millions of them, all white by the way, were captured and enslaved by Muslims in the 9th century and later by the Ottoman Turks. Slavery existed when the Roman Empire controlled the Mediterranean and most of Europe from the 1st through the 5th centuries. Slavery existed when Alexander the Great conquered Persia in the 4th century BC. It was so common that Aristotle simply considered it natural. The slave master model was just how the world operated in the great philosopher's day. Slavery existed during the time of the ancient Egyptians 5,000 years ago. As far back as we can go in human history, we find slavery. As renowned historian John Steele Gordon notes from time immemorial, slaves were a major item of commerce. As much as a third of the population of the ancient world was enslaved.
Well, she went back into history, but obviously she did not explain the difference. Now, if you go back in time, you'll understand that there were different types of slavery, and you need to be specific to that time period in which you're analyzing to understand, to that specific country as well, how slaves were treated and what their status was in the society in which they were living. You cannot just generalize and say all slavery all over the world was the same thing and individuals had the same status, because that wasn't the case. Now, I stop here because you have this quote from John Steele Gordon, which is really important. Now, many people actually consider that the majority of the population living in the times that we live in today, they are also slaves. They have their own definition of the slaves. That's why it's important to provide context and to explain the different definitions of slavery. They understand or they think that there are more than slaves today because people are forced to work or to have money in order to survive. If you don't have money, if you don't work, you cannot survive in the system in which we live today. There are certain countries where there's a mixture of liberal capitalism and socialism in which you have benefits and you have certain services that with the use of taxpayers' money is provided to certain individuals that they cannot work. Now, there are certain peoples that believe that we are slaves today as well. So I cannot just take the definition of slavery from these people and generalize, okay, and say, okay, not everyone is a slave, okay? You need to be specific of the country and the time period. But at least you went back 3,000 years ago to explain that slavery existed. It was just any status, okay?
Here's the second thing you need to know. White people were the first to formally put an end to slavery. In 1833, Britain was the first country in the history of the world to pass a Slavery Abolition Act. They were quickly followed by France, who in 1848 abolished slavery in her many colonies.
Okay, let's explain one thing here. When she says that white people were the first people to abolish slavery, have to be really careful with this statement, okay? Because as I explained to you before, there were many African empires and African countries that put a stop to the transatlantic slave trade. And even before that, slavery was abolished. Now, she is talking about, she generalizes slavery from the past, and she's saying slavery existed before, but now she's being specific, okay? And she didn't mention that she's talking right now about transatlantic slavery and how it was abolished by the British and the French for political reasons. Now, her generalization now is working against her because she hasn't been specific and she's just saying these people abolished slavery. No, slavery was abolished before that in general terms. Now, she's referring to transatlantic slavery because she hasn't been specific on what she's referring to. Her argument is kind of all over the place. Now, when she says white people, what the hell? This just were empires, okay? These were colonial empires that conquer other countries and took the resources, they stole them, they abused these populations. Now, that's history. That happened. All countries did that. In Africa, in Asia, it's just history, okay? Now, to say that white people abolished slavery, and she did mention the British first, it's like, yo, hold a minute. The British had a colony, which is America, where she is from now, that there was a rebellion against the British Empire. And this colony relied on slave labor, okay, in order to survive, to keep those farms of cotton and other produce that they sold to the rest of the world. So one of the solutions against these guys, which is something that many countries do today as well, in the form of tariffs, in the form of sanctions, what it is abolish slavery for political reasons. Slavery, as she say, existed before, but the British and these empires came and commercialized it. They made it a commerce, they made it a business, they industrialized it. The use of individuals, the reduction of these individuals to animals, basically, and allow these individuals to be sold. Although they were Christians, and Christianity doesn't allow this, they justify it this way. Now, when they abolish slavery, the people that suffer under this unjust system, they were not compensated for the treatment they received from the slave masters. However, the slave masters, they were compensated. So the British government compensated these individuals for the loss of their property. They considered these individuals property. So they pay them money, which they finished paying not long ago. So when we talk about who benefited from this transatlantic slavery, even the descendant of these slave masters, they continue benefiting from it because the British, French, and other governments continue compensating the slave masters for the loss of the property, which was these slaves, which were human beings. And this is what she's failing to explain. These individuals became a commodity. Although they were human beings, they became less than human beings. And that justifies or explains the treatment that happened later in the United States with the Jim Crow laws and with all the racism law or racist laws, etc., that we had in the United States against black people. Okay? Now, I don't understand why she needs to mention the word white and emphasize on this to explain that they abolished slavery. The first people that abolished slavery, they were the slaves, and many of them were black. They're also Indian slaves, the Irish slaves, okay? Now, these are the first people that abolished it, not really white people. Anyways, let's continue listening.
Then, of course, came the 13th Amendment in the United States Constitution. After centuries of human slavery, white men led the world in putting an end to the abhorrent practice. That includes the 300,000 Union soldiers, overwhelmingly white, who died during the Civil War. Now, am I saying that this makes white people better than anyone else? Of course not. My purpose here is to simply tell the truth. And
Just to add something, a point about the Civil War in the USA and how these individuals fought. The North fought against the South. The main reason wasn't to end the slavery. In fact, there were many generals from the North that they actually said if they could solve the issues they had with the South without ending the slavery, they would be happy to do so. Now, the North needed numbers, And these numbers were in between the southern enemies. Therefore, strategically, it made sense to make use of these slaves against your enemies. Okay? Because they won the war, they won the civil war. However, the laws that they implemented in the country, they were restraining laws for black people, for the descendants of the first slaves that landed there. Okay? So I'm not really sure about her argument here. These people did not do it to liberate black people. They did it again for political reasons because they needed the numbers and they needed these people to fight against the South. If you send a message to the South saying that, hey, you are free in the North, trying to escape to the North, and many actually did, okay, and then they used them to fight against the South for political reasons. That's it, okay? Let's continue watching.
The truth is that human history is complicated. No one, regardless of skin color, stands guiltless. Yet today we are never told to consider the murderous Persian Empire or the cannibalism of indigenous tribes of North and South America or the heinous actions under the imperialistic Muslim, Chinese, Mongol, or Japanese empires, to name just a few.
Whoa, whoa. Not sure why she mentioned that at all. She got into saying that no one is free of guilt from slavery, but similarly, no one is free of guilt for wrongdoing. To say every empire did abuse populations, so not sure if she's trying to defend here European empires and the practice by bringing Chinese imperialism, Japanese imperialism, cannibalism. Like, what the hell is this? Anyways, let's continue listening to her.
Instead, we're told that slavery is a white phenomenon. And like all persistent lies, this lie spawns a bunch of other lies. On social media,
I don't know if this is true, but if you study in Africa or Europe, they don't say that at all. They don't tell you that slavery is a white phenomenon. Maybe in America they do, and that makes no sense to me. If they do that, I agree with her. That's wrong. Okay, it's wrong. But what I will say is that the root of racism, like colorism, the way in which they use color to segregate people in different ethnicities, that's a white phenomenon. Okay, that was invented in the West, and that led to racism against these people in the United States. So I think she needs to be clear on that. Maybe slavery is not a white phenomenon, but racism, which have very negative consequences of the African Americans, as they call themselves, that is a phenomenon, white phenomenon. And I call it white because it was invented by Western intellectuals, Western governments implemented it, okay? But not all white people agree with this at all. And as I said before, I'm not the kind of person that look at skin color, okay, to kind of understand or predict an individual's behavior, but I have to put a hat on and try to explain this way, okay? And trying to explain this with these colors that they actually use. It's all a construction, a human construction, a human invention, which is in our mind. These are ideas that are really physical within our mind, just like a wall that we cannot go through, okay? We cannot see beyond that. We cannot decompose that and eliminate it from our mind. Now it's part of our lives, and many people fall for this, okay?
I come across extraordinary depictions about how Africans lived like pharaohs before Europeans came and laid waste to their paradise. I wish any of this were true, but
Well, it's true. Like, there are many African countries where, during those times that she's referring to, they live like pharaohs. I mean, Egypt is in Africa, and you have Mali, which was a huge empire full of gold. Okay, so you have many African countries where they live well. The empires were strong, and in certain periods, historic periods, they were more advanced than the West, for example. So they were not just living under war and with flies in the face, as I think she's suggesting here, because it's actually saying that it's not true that the Africans lived this way. I mean, you can see today how many natural resources are in African countries. they were making use of them in the past, not now at the moment. But I mean, it's true. I'm not saying that they were the richest people in the world and they were living in paradise. What I'm saying is that in some countries, the kings, queens, the elite, they live this way. And some of these empires, they were very sophisticated, okay? The Africans did not enter history when the transatlantic slavery started. Africa was there before Europe, and they have a lot of history and culture that this lady is just, she doesn't even know. She doesn't even know about. Let's continue listening.
It's not. It's a fantasy. The truth is that Africans were sold into slavery by other black Africans, and in many cases, sold for items as trivial as gin and mirrors. Whites didn't go into the interior and round up the natives. They waited on the coast for their black partners to bring them black bodies.
Okay, let's talk about this as well. Yes, the colonial powers, they went deep into the jungles. They went deep into the jungles in order to fight those that rebelled against the slavery. And there's plenty of history about this, many history books written by white historians explain this. They even went up to the river Congo in order to go deep into the jungle. Obviously, there was conflicts, as there are conflicts in every country between different civilizations, as there were countries between different African empires, different African tribes. So as I said before, these tribes fought against each other, and then the enemies were made slaves. Okay, now this you don't blame the individual or the soldier because of a war. You blame those that are making war possible. So you don't blame those that sell these slaves as human beings for slavery. You blame those that created a commerce, okay, and they're buying these slaves. So I think her approach is completely incorrect. Although maybe both should have the blame. If you look at it from today's perspective, okay, from today's points of view and mentality against like human rights violations. But I think these kind of topics, historic topics, have to be looked at from the perspective and the understanding of the people from that epoch, from that period, okay? And in this case, she's not doing that. And during those times, as she herself said, slavery was something normal. So why is she criticizing these black, as she called them, Africans, from selling slaves? According to her, they were doing something normal. The problem is, those that took the slaves and they created a slave market, what were they doing with those people? Okay? It's like during the Roman times, you have the Colosseums where you have gladiators fighting. Many of these gladiators, they were slaves. Now, do you blame the gladiator? Do you blame the person that captured these slaves and then they bring them to the Colosseum to fight? Or do you blame the emperors who are basically organizing these bloody events in order to keep people away from the politics of the Roman Empire, which was completely crumbling? It's clear, those that facilitate the system that convert human beings into animals and strip them from the human dignity, those are the ones to blame, not the ones that sell the slaves to these slavers, which in fact they were the ones that created that system. Those who sold the slaves in Africa, as she said at the beginning of the video, which now she's contradicting herself, it was something they did before. They didn't know these people would become animals, because one of them could be a slave in the future and they'll go exactly through the same thing. And as I said before, these African tribes and countries, they fought. They fought against the slave traders in Ghana, in Angola, and in many other countries to stop the slave trade and to stop the treatment of their own people the way they did. So that destroyed her whole argument about white people not going deep into the jungle to capture slaves and having black people to bring the slaves. In fact, white people, as she called them, or these slave traders, they paid money They paid with pots, pans, certain things that they were not in the continent to buy these people. So they were the ones buying the people. And in many cases, they use really rogue tribes, okay, in order to capture these people and bring it to them. And there was The Woman King, I think, is the movie, which explained this really well. In fact, the Dahomey tribe in Nigeria, they sold people to the slave traders, and then after realizing how the people were treated and the problem with demographics that it was causing, they rebel against them. And they use tribes, they pay some tribes to fight other tribes to generate slaves. And then these slaves were sold to them in exchange of weapons for these tribes to go and fight the other tribes. So here you go, a person creating a massive problem, okay, cleaning his hands off this problem, but making sure that the business continues thanks to the actions. Because the main question is, if these slave traders did not put an outpost in the beach, for example in the Gold Coast, for these people to sell slaves, these people wouldn't be selling the slaves to them. These slaves will be in jail in their tribes, and that's it. They wouldn't be sold to these people. So the fact that they were there to do this kind of business, that they knew that it was prohibited under their own religion, is really worrying. And the fact that this lady does not even recognize this is also worrying. I don't know how she got to this point.
The stark reality is that our lives had very little value to our ancestors. Here's the third thing you need to know. If you think slavery is a relic of the past, you're wrong. There are some 700,000 slaves in Africa today, right now. That's the lowest estimate that I could find. Other sources say there are many more. For context, that's almost twice as many slaves as were ever brought to the United States. Child soldiers, human trafficking, forced labor, these are the conditions that currently exist within the same sub-Saharan.
Yeah, so basically she's blaming Africans for slavery in the past. She's blaming Africans for slavery in the present. And she made out some numbers here of 700,000 slaves. And look at the nations she's highlighting. None of them from the north, which are Arab nations, the majority of them, okay? Yeah, most of them there. They're not highlighted, the Arab nations, but then look at all the orange ones, the sub-Saharan African ones, and majority populated by black people. She's saying there are slaves, 700,000 in these countries. Child soldiers, like what the hell? That means there are slaves all over the world. Even in the United States, where you have prisons, where you have people in jail working and not even getting paid or getting low paid whilst they are in prison. That's a slavery too. Okay, I can make up any terms like, okay, that guy there who is underpaid working for X companies is also a slave. So she just made out an argument here to justify what she's saying. As an African person, I'm telling you, this 700,000 figure she's bringing up, I don't know where she's getting it from. I would like to see that research and how they counted all the children that are child soldiers due to the fact that there are wars, many of them instigated by big corporations that extract minerals, oil, and all type of natural resources from these countries. She needs to provide context. She just can't come and say, okay, there is 700,000 slaves. Explain the reason why you consider these people as slaves, and explain the reason why these people became, according to her, slaves. Okay? Now, if we're talking about forced labor, there is forced labor in every country. Even in developed country, there is forced labor. When you have people that have to work 2 to 3 jobs in order to pay their bills or to survive in the country. That's slavery, as I told you before, according to certain people today. But for some reason, she's got a beef with Africa, and she wants to justify her argument and convince certain people that there's still slaves in Africa.
Region where the transatlantic slave trade originated. African bodies are being sold today like they were sold then, and no, they are not being purchased by any country of white men. In fact, slavery, by any traditional definition, is exclusively practiced today within non-white countries. But we hear almost nothing about that. Just like we hear nothing about how slavery was universal until good people in Europe and America ended it 2 centuries ago.
Yo, I mean, what do you mean with that? Like, slavery is practiced in non-white countries. That's a huge statement. That's a very big statement, which I hope she can back it up. Okay, I mean, even in the UK and other countries that fund families keeping refugees as slaves in the houses, okay, and working for free as nannies, okay. There are many cases where there are sex slaves in Europe and in America. These are females or males used as sex laborers. So I don't really know what she's talking about. There's actually a lot of slaves in the US as well, if we use her definition of slavery. But as I say, it seems like she's got a beef with Africa and non-white countries, and she's trying to defend what she considers white countries, which I guess she means European countries. Then she go into saying good white people that abolish slavery. She's talking about the kings. She's talking about the emperors. She's talking about these politicians in Western countries that they did it for political reasons. And although they went and abolished slavery to stop the trade to the Americas, they continue with the colonies. They continue with the colonies. They continue abusing the people in the colonies based on the race, based on the country where they're coming from, and based on the fact that they considered them colonial subjects. Okay? They were colonial subjects, not slaves. But I could say during that period of colonialism and neo-colonialism, these colonial subjects, they were also slaves. And these good white people that abolished slavery, as she said, they continue having the slaves after that at a greater level, not just in the USA, but all over the colonies, where they implemented certain rules and laws, and the native from those colonies were kind of second-class citizens. Okay? So let's finish this.
Why? Because our so-called leaders, black and white, wouldn't profit from it. Black victimhood is nothing if not profitable. It elects politicians and funds racial grievance groups. And if black Americans began to view themselves as partners in the American dream, if we embraced the patriotic spirit that holds all men are created equal, the patriotic spirit that...
Yeah, I think she's right on that. Like, obviously the black vote, I guess, is important in America. There's a huge population of black people in the USA. Therefore, it's important for politicians to gain the votes from these individuals. Okay? So I agree with her on that. Now, I think she's talking about some kind of ideology that black people have regarding towards white people and the way they see them. Obviously, mate, you don't have to be grateful for what they did to your ancestors at all. Neither Africans, nor African Americans, neither any of the countries that were under imperialist rule or under slavery. You don't have to be grateful for what they did to you. History is history. And I'm saying you shouldn't you shouldn't be angry for what they did. It's history after all. But at the same time, you shouldn't forget about what they did. Just like Western countries don't forget about the history, and they tell history every day at schools and universities, and what happened between France and Germany during the Second World War, what happened to the Jewish people as well. So why should these people now, I was about to say integrate, but where they're going to integrate? They're part of that society already, and society cannot be uniform. The society takes multiple forms, and within that society you have these black people which they were unfairly treated in the United States. There's a whole history of this, man. Jim Crow and stuff like that. That was crazy. So these people were unfairly treated, and they shouldn't forget about that treatment, because that could happen again at any time. At any time. And this behavior, this prejudice towards them, is still present in many people in America. Many of them, they still treat them that way, they still see them that way, and they'll be happy if they went back into their slave status in society. Therefore, they have to cover their backs. And that thinking, that approach from the African American is justifiable. And asking them to be part of a society which treated them that way is very naive to ask such thing. And at the same time, is also a person that does not consider the fact that these people went through a lot, okay? The society must change, yes, but to make changes in society, the political leaders in the country, they're the ones who need to integrate with the societies and understand what their needs are, not necessarily the opposite. Now, she's talking about an American dream. I wonder what the American dream is. These people build America. These people were working in farms. These people were cultivating cotton. These people they brought to America, some of these slaves, they were not just normal slaves. They were people that have knowledge on agriculture. In fact, these people were selected. Those who knew about agriculture, they were selected and brought to the Americas in order to make sure that the produce grew successfully. So these people built America. Maybe no creating the machines, but with their bare hands cultivating cotton, tobacco, and many other crops. So they have they have America in their back, and they should be treated as part of society, and the interests should be considered at all times. So they should be grateful for what happened to them. They shouldn't forget it. And that American dream is the dream of certain people that came from Europe with the aims or objective. Their objective was to become rich, to open a company, or to live well in the USA. Whilst these people, they were part of the creation of that country. There's no such thing as an American dream for them. What there is the one justice. And I don't believe in reparations. History is done. History is history. But I think those who benefited from it, they should have stopped benefiting from it completely. And these African Americans that suffer under slavery, true, they should just live in a society, but they need to be aware of what happened in the past and also what could happen in the future. The fact that there's still people that believe that they should become slaves, or they are second-class citizens, or they don't deserve the same rights as other American citizens.
Is our real heritage, then the race hustlers would soon be out of business. And who wants that? I'm Candance Owens, author of Blackout for Prager University.
Okay. If you're interested, just buy her book, Blackout, or whatever she did say. I'm sure that's my point of view. I completely disagree with most of the things she said. I'm talking about 80% of what she said. I think it wasn't very accurate. Okay, I don't know if it's ignorance or the fact that she's just trying to avoid certain things, or the fact that she's not providing enough context to what she is saying because the video is short or is 5 minutes long. But I watch other interviews that they did to this person, and the majority of the people that support her, they are the conservatives in the US. You know, some of them they call them right wings or whatever. But her position is always that, which is really strange. And the American dream, or make America great again, even that for certain people, mainly black people in the USA, what does it mean to make America great again? Go back to the 60s? Go back to the 50s? Go back to what period of time where America was great for them? Okay? So, I just wanted to give my feedback on this, my reaction. And obviously, as always, I will continue informing you.